All right, so you know those stories, those historical moments where you're just like, no way they pulled that off. Like those underdog victories that seem impossible.
Right.
Until they happen?
Yeah.
Like, come on, why did that even work?
Yeah.
Well, get ready because today we are diving deep into one of those moments.
Yeah.
The Siege of Yorktown, 1781.
Oh, yeah.
The American Revolution is in full swing, and this becomes the final major land battle.
It changes everything.
It changes everything.
Yeah, what's so captivating about Yorktown is it's not just a battle. It was this perfect storm of strategy, brilliant alliances, just raw grit, all kind of converging on this little Virginia peninsula. Yeah, and I think the details of how this win came together, it's going to surprise you.
Yeah, okay, so big picture. Everyone remembers how it ends, right? Americans win, British surrender, freedom rings and all that.
Yeah.
But I gotta admit, like, reading through these sources, I was floored by all the stuff happening behind the scenes.
Oh, for sure.
Like, it was not a straight shot to victory.
It's easy to forget that in 1780, things were not looking so good for the Americans.
Yeah.
The revolution had been dragging on for years. Both sides were exhausted, and a clear path to winning the whole thing.
It wasn't clear.
It wasn't there. And it's in this pressure cooker that the Americans do something really audacious. They form an alliance with France.
An alliance? Okay, hold on. Not just like, hey, France, can you spare some troops? But like full-on teaming up with the French, who were, let's be real, not exactly on friendly terms with the British at the time.
Right, exactly.
Like, what were they thinking?
It was a huge risk, but also a huge potential reward. For the Americans, this brand new nation, it was a lifeline. The French brought serious military power experience and a navy.
Oh, yeah, that navy.
Which, as we'll see, becomes absolutely critical. But for the French, this was a chance to, stick it to their old rival, weaken Britain on the world stage. But it was a gamble. Supporting a rebellion against one of the strongest powers in the world could have backfired spectacularly.
And speaking of risky moves and things backfiring, we got to talk about Benedict Arnold.
Yeah.
About Benedict Arnold, the traitor.
Yeah, his story is one of those that just adds so many layers to all of this. Most people know about his betrayal at West Point, right?
Yeah.
But what's fascinating is what he does after switching sides. He actually fights for the British leads raids in Virginia, and his actions directly contribute to Cornwallis, the British commander.
Oh, wow.
Ending up at Yorktown in the first place.
Whoa, so Arnold unintentionally, helps orchestrate his former side's victory. History is wild. Okay, but hold on. Why Virginia? Wouldn't it make more sense to attack New York? That was the British stronghold, right?
You'd think so, right. Everyone at the time expected an attack on New York, but a bunch of things shifted the focus south. Cornwallis was this really, I guess you could say, overconfident British general after some early wins in the south.
Ah, he got a little cocky.
A little bit, yeah. He overextended his forces in Virginia, underestimated the Americans, and basically got stuck in this region that was perfect for a siege.
Oh, so it was like the terrain itself was working against him.
Kinda, yeah. And then you've got the communication or lack thereof between Cornwallis and his boss, General Clinton, back in New York.
Oh, boy.
It was a recipe for disaster. Clinton's sending confusing orders. Cornwallis is misinterpreting them. They're constantly disagreeing on strategy. And that created this opening that Washington and the French, led by Rochambeau,
They were not going to miss that.
they seized it.
And they had a secret weapon up their sleeve, or should I say a secret player, the Marquis de Lafayette.
Lafayette was absolutely key. He was kind of Washington's right-hand man in this whole campaign. While Washington and Rochambeau are making their way south, Lafayette's down in Virginia playing this cat-and-mouse game with Cornwallis, just constantly maneuvering strategic retreats and gathering intel. He kept Cornwallis guessing and bought the Allies precious time.
Oh, so Lafayette was like the distraction.
Yeah, he was the ultimate distraction.
Keeping Cornwallis busy while the big plan was coming together. Okay, so picture this. Thousands of troops led by Washington and Rochambeau marching hundreds of miles south, trying to keep it all quiet. That is not an easy feat.
Yeah, especially in the 18th century. No cars, no planes, just thousands of men on foot and horseback trying to move undetected. It was a massive logistical challenge.
A massive logistical challenge.
They used all sorts of clever tricks, fake dispatches, troop movements designed to mislead British spies. It was really a masterpiece of deception, and it worked. The British were completely caught off guard.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Remember, the American army was notoriously underfunded.
Yeah.
And during this march, the soldiers, many of whom hadn't been paid in ages, they demand their pay, and not in that basically worthless continental paper money, but in hard coins. Can you imagine the tension?
Oh, yeah. It was a huge crisis. These weren't just soldiers. They were, farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, regular people who had left their lives to fight for this cause, and they were tired of being paid in promises.
They wanted what they were owed.
Yeah, they wanted what they deserved. And Rochambeau, recognizing how serious this was, how important it was to keep the Americans on board, he makes a crucial decision. He uses his own supply of hard Spanish silver.
What on Spanish silver?
Yeah, remember that Spanish financial backing we mentioned?
Uh-huh.
Well, this is where it comes in handy. Rochambeau uses that Spanish silver to pay the American troops.
Wow, talk about putting your money where your mouth is.
Exactly. It was a huge morale booster for the Americans, and it really solidified the trust between the French and American forces.
Like, hey, we're in this together.
Exactly. We're in this together.
Okay, so we got armies marching and alliances being tested. But how do you actually trap an army like the British? Like, how do you pin them down?
That's where the French Navy comes in.
Yeah.
This is where that alliance really pays off.
Uh,
Just a few weeks before the siege starts, there's this naval battle, the Battle of the Chesapeake. It's often overlooked, but it was absolutely decisive. Yeah, it often gets overshadowed by the siege itself. The French fleet, led by the Comte de Grasse, engages the British fleet, and they win a major victory. This gives them control of the Chesapeake Bay, which basically cuts off Cornwallis's escape route and prevents British reinforcements from reaching him.
So the French Navy essentially seals the deal.
They lock him in.
Without that victory, the whole siege might have gone very differently.
Oh, absolutely. It shows how important a coordinated strategy was, land A&D naval forces working together. The French naval victory was just as crucial to the outcome at Yorktown as the land battle itself.
So we've got all our pieces in place. Cornwallis bottled up in Yorktown, the Allied armies closing in, and the French fleet controlling the bay. Things are about to get real interesting. So the stage is set. Cornwallis is stuck in Yorktown. The Allied armies have him surrounded, and the French fleet is ruling the Chesapeake Bay. You can practically feel the tension ratcheting up, right? It's late September 1781, and Washington and Rochambeau arrive with their combined forces, tightening the noose around Cornwallis.
The Allies hit the ground running. They immediately start setting up their siege works, which is no small feat. They're digging trenches, building artillery emplacements, and strategically positioning their troops for what's going to be a long and complex operation.
So they're not going for a quick smash-and-grab attack. It sounds like Washington's opting for a more methodical approach. Why a siege?
Washington was a brilliant strategist. He understood that a direct assault on Yorktown, while potentially faster, would likely result in very heavy casualties. Sieges were a common tactic in 18th century warfare. They allowed for a more controlled approach, slowly wearing down the enemy's defenses and morale.
It's like a game of chess. Each move carefully planned out to outmaneuver the opponent.
Precisely. And with the French fleet controlling the Chesapeake, time was on their side. They could afford to be patient and methodical, slowly increasing the pressure on Cornwallis.
But I imagine a siege is no walk in the park either. What were conditions like for the troops on both sides?
Brutal, to say the least. Disease was a constant threat, supplies were often scarce, and the constant fear of bombardment created a nerve-wracking atmosphere. There were skirmishes, probing attacks, and constant tension as both sides tested each other's defenses. One detail that really struck me was the account of British troops being so desperate for food that they were forced to slaughter their own horses.
That's a pretty grim image.
Yeah.
It really paints a picture of how dire the situation was becoming for Cornwallis. So how did the Allies start putting the squeeze on the British?
The first major step was the construction of what's called the first parallel. This is a trench dug parallel to the enemy lines, close enough to allow for effective artillery bombardment. On October 6th, under the cover of a stormy night, Washington himself ceremonially strikes the first blow, driving his pickaxe into the ground to mark the beginning of the trench.
That's a great little anecdote. It really humanizes these historical figures.
It's those little details that often get overlooked but reveal so much about the characters involved. This act was symbolic, of course, but it also served to boost the morale of the troops, reminding them that their commander-in-chief was right there with them, sharing in the hardship.
So the first parallel is complete. What happens next?
The Allies begin moving their artillery into position along the trench, and on October 9th, the bombardment begins. We're not talking about a few cannons here and there. This was a coordinated barrage from dozens of cannons, mortars, and howitzers, all targeting key British defenses.
I'm trying to imagine the sound deafening. Were there any specific targets they were aiming for?
Oh, absolutely. They were systematically targeting British artillery batteries, fortifications, supply depots, even ships in the harbor. The goal was to cripple the British ability to fight back, disrupt their command and control, and generally make their lives as miserable as possible. One of the early casualties of this bombardment was the British frigate HMS Guadeloupe. It was forced to flee across the York River and eventually scuttled to avoid capture.
I bet the French fleet, still controlling the bay, was adding to Cornwallis's woes.
They certainly were. The French ships joined the bombardment, targeting British vessels in the harbor. One particularly well-aimed shot set the HMS Charon ablaze, which in turn ignited several other ships, creating a chaotic inferno in the harbor.
It's hard to imagine the stress and fear that must have gripped the British troops trapped in Yorktown under this constant barrage.
It was a relentless assault, day and night, with no respite. The British tried to return fire, but their efforts were increasingly ineffective. Their defenses were crumbling, desertions were on the rise, and their morale was plummeting. Cornwallis, desperate for relief, sent urgent messages to Clinton in New York, pleading for reinforcements.
But it was too late, wasn't it? The trap had been sprung, and the Allies had no intention of letting go.
Exactly. The French fleet held the bay, the Allied armies had Cornwallis completely surrounded, and those reinforcements were never going to arrive.
So what does Cornwallis do? He's running out of options.
In a desperate gamble, he orders a number of his own ships sunk in the harbor. He's hoping to create obstacles that might hinder any potential Allied landings, but it's a move born of desperation, a sign that he's starting to realize the severity of his situation.
It's almost like he's trying to delay the inevitable. So, with Cornwallis on the ropes, what's Washington's next move?
To tighten the noose even further, Washington orders the construction of a second parallel, a trench dug even closer to the British lines. This would allow the Allies to bring their artillery within point-blank range of the main British defenses. However, there's a problem. Two British fortifications, redoubts 9 and 10, stand in the way of the second parallel's completion.
These redoubts must have been pretty significant obstacles if they were holding up the entire siege operation. What made them so important?
They were strategically vital for the British defense. Their location allowed them to provide flanking fire that threatened the Allied siege lines, and they prevented the complete encirclement of Yorktown. Capturing these redoubts became essential for the Allies to achieve a decisive victory.
So how do they take these redoubts? Another artillery bombardment?
That was an option, but it would have taken time and likely resulted in significant casualties on both sides. Washington, ever the bold leader, decides on a more daring approach. A nighttime assault.
Now that sounds intense. A nighttime assault on fortified positions.
Yeah.
What was the plan? Okay, so nighttime assault it is. It's pitch black. You've got these two heavily defended redoubts, and the entire siege hinges on this moment. Like, I'm getting nervous just thinking about it.
Yeah, it was a bold move.
Yeah.
A high-stakes gamble, for sure. Washington's plan was to send 2 columns of troops, 1 French and 1 American, to attack the redoubts simultaneously.
At the same time.
Yeah, a coordinated attack. They were relying on stealth and surprise to overwhelm the British before they could really react.
So basically, catch them sleeping.
Well, not literally, but, catch them off guard. I can only imagine the tension as those troops got ready, knowing that at any moment things could explode.
Yeah, it must have been terrifying.
These were experienced soldiers. They'd seen their fair share of combat. But a nighttime assault is a whole other level. They're going up against these fortified positions in the dark, not knowing what they're going to encounter.
So who was in charge of these columns?
The French column heading for Redoubt 9 was led by the Count of Dupont, and the Americans tasked with capturing Redoubt 10 were under the command of Colonel Alexander Hamilton.
Wait, Hamilton. As in Founding Father, First Secretary of the Treasury Hamilton.
The one and only. This is before his days of shaping America's financial system. Here we see him as a young, ambitious military leader, eager to prove himself in battle. And his actions at Redoubt 10, well, they definitely solidified his reputation for bravery and leadership.
Okay, so we've got Hamilton leading this charge in the dead of night. It's like something out of a movie. So what happens? Do they just march up to the redoubts and start swinging?
It was more calculated than that. Washington, always thinking ahead. He ordered a diversionary attack somewhere else to distract the British, draw their attention away from the real target. Very clever. The French and American columns, they were under strict orders to stay completely silent until they were right on top of the enemy.
So much pressure. Can you imagine? You're creeping through the darkness, every sound magnified. Any minute you could run into an enemy patrol.
Exactly. They had to rely on their training, their instincts, their discipline. It must have been incredibly tense. But they pressed on. driven by their belief in the cause they were fighting for.
What happened when they finally reached the redoubts?
All hell broke loose. The Americans, they hit Redoubt 10, facing heavy musket fire grenades exploding all around them.
Wow.
But they didn't hesitate. They charged into those fortifications, using axes to hack through the abatis, those sharpened branches meant to slow them down. They crossed the ditch surrounding the redoubt and scaled the walls. It was hand-to-hand combat, brutal and chaotic.
I'm trying to picture the clash of steel, the shouts, the smoke.
Yeah, it was a scene of absolute chaos and bravery. Hamilton, he was right there in the thick of it, rallying his troops, urging them forward. They fought with incredible ferocity, pushing back the British inch by bloody inch.
And what about the French? How did their attack go?
They had their own challenges. The abattis around Redoubt 9 was really thick and tough to get through. But the French, they're known for their adaptability, right? They figured out a way through forming tight columns, using their combined weight to push through the obstacles. And then they surged forward like a wave, overwhelming the British defenders.
So both redoubts captured in a matter of hours. It's incredible.
It was a testament to the courage and skill of the Allied troops, and it was a decisive moment in the siege. With those redoubts gone, the British were in serious trouble.
So what's the fallout? What does this mean for Cornwallis?
With redoubts 9 and 10 in Allied hands, the noose was tightening. They could now complete their second parallel. That trench dug even closer to the main British defenses, bringing their artillery within point-blank range.
Oh man, they were in a bad spot.
The bombardment intensified. Cornwallis was running out of time, running out of options.
No escape route, no reinforcements. His defenses crumbling around him.
Exactly. He makes one last desperate attempt to save his army. He tries to evacuate his troops across the York River under cover of darkness, hoping to slip past the French fleet and regroup on the other side.
That sounds risky.
Oh, incredibly risky. And as luck would have it, a huge storm blows in right in the middle of the evacuation, scattering their boats and ruining the plan.
It's like something out of a Greek tragedy.
It must have felt that way to Cornwallis. He'd been outmaneuvered, outgunned, and now even the elements were against him. Facing the inevitable with his army exhausted, his supplies dwindling, and nowhere to go, he makes the difficult decision to surrender.
So on October 19th, 1781, just a few weeks after the siege began, the British lay down their arms and march out of Yorktown. It's the end of a long and bloody chapter in American history.
The surrender ceremony was a powerful moment. I mean, for the Americans, it was a triumphant victory, the culmination of years of fighting and sacrifice. For the British, it was a bitter defeat, a blow to their national pride and their global ambitions.
I bet the scene itself was pretty heavy.
Imagine it, rows upon rows of victorious French and American troops, their uniforms crisp, their weapons gleaming in the sun. And between them, marching slowly with their flags, furled the defeated British soldiers.
You can practically hear the drums.
Cornwallis himself, he claimed to be ill and didn't attend the ceremony. He sent his second-in-command Brigadier General Charles O'Hara in his place.
I imagine even in surrender there were some tense moments.
Definitely O'Hara. He initially tried to surrender to Rochambeau, the French commander, but Rochambeau, in a show of respect for Washington, he refused to accept the sword.
Wow.
Washington himself also declined to take it. He directed O'Hara to surrender to his second-in-command, Major General Benjamin Lincoln.
That's a really interesting detail. Like, even in victory, Washington's acknowledging the contributions of his officers and the importance of the alliance with the French.
It was a subtle but powerful gesture, and it really underscored the fact that this was an American victory won with the help of their allies.
So the siege is over. The British has surrendered. What happens next? What's the impact of this victory?
Yorktown sent shockwaves through both nations and across Europe. In America, it was met with celebrations and relief. In Britain, it fueled calls for peace and a serious rethinking of their war strategy.
So is this the end of the war?
Not officially, but it was the beginning of the end. Peace negotiations were already underway, but Yorktown gave them a huge boost, and within 2 years, the Treaty of Paris was signed, formally recognizing American independence and ending the Revolutionary War.
So this one battle, this siege on a Virginia peninsula, it changed the course of history.
Absolutely. It showed the world what a determined group of people fighting for their freedom could achieve. And it cemented the idea that alliances matter, that sometimes you need to team up with others to achieve a common goal.
It's amazing to think how one event can have such a ripple effect across time.
History is full of these turning points, these moments where the actions of individuals and nations collide, shaping the course of events for generations to come. As you continue to learn about this period in history, I encourage you to think about the legacy of Yorktown. How did this victory not only create a new nation, but also shape the world we live in today? It's a question worth pondering.
It really is. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the Siege of Yorktown. I gotta say, I learned a ton. Those details about Benedict Arnold and the horse meat and that nighttime assault on the redoubts, it's incredible the things you don't learn in textbooks.
It's those often overlooked stories that really bring history to life.
Thanks for joining us on this journey through history. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the past, the present, or maybe even the future. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.